I'm joined today by head coach at Longwood University, Griff Aldrich. And coach, I really appreciate you being here. And so my first question is, you've been having these conversations with black assistant coaches, black players, black former players. You've been in this world for a long time. You've got a really interesting story. You started off in the corporate world, but the whole time you were there, you were working in grassroots basketball. So you've been in the basketball world really your entire life, having been a college athlete yourself. Like I said, you got a very interesting background. And I'm curious, in the conversations you're having with your players and your former players who were black, are the issues of nonviolent police harassment, be it getting pulled over without having committed a moving violation, be it getting asked for your ID when you were just minding your own business, walking down the sidewalk with a couple of buddies, or being treated with undue hostility or unwarranted suspicion, all of the things that go under the nonviolent police harassment umbrella. Ballpark figure, is that commonplace for your black players and assistants to have had those experiences, or is it unusual?
Yeah, no, I hate to say this, and I'm guilty of not exploring this issue even more deeply. And frankly, I think we're also in a period right now where black athletes, black young men, people of color are feeling more empowered and emboldened to kind of speak honestly about what they've experienced. And we have talked to our team here at Longwood. Certainly have reached out to other friends and colleagues to kind of talk about this. And then, as you say, Pete, I mean, this is a topic that has been near and dear to me. Just in my time in Houston, in the Third Ward, as you know. And I would say the overwhelming, and I don't want to say majority, it was almost unanimous of people who I've spoken to, players on our existing team who have experienced, racist incidents, or at a minimum have fear that they will experience that. And it's the systemic and institutional racism and biases that I think we all possess, in varying degrees. And I think that's one of the big issues that even though I knew that, to hear our guys just talk about it so plainly and transparently and authentically, it's heart-wrenching.
You touched on an important point, bias, racial bias. And I'm of the opinion, as I think we've discussed in the past, that racism, like any human attribute, has a scale.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to be Hitler in order to be a racist. And right. I'm certainly of the opinion that if your bias is race-based, then you are a racist. That doesn't mean you hate black people per se, or that you wish them harm. But if your bias is racial in its nature, I would call that racism. And a lot of Americans are sort of growing to accept that racial bias is prevalent. And yet, way too many of us tend to think there's like a magic exemption in police departments. And it's like, well, police departments are Americans just like the rest of us. So if we suffer from some level of racial bias, then of course we're going to see that in police departments as well. And my follow-up question is, Coach, so you said a minute ago that it's just about universal, that your black players, former players, and close friends of yours who were black, it's just about universal that they've at a minimum experienced some level of nonviolent police harassment, which, by the way, is unconstitutional. You're not allowed, we have a thing called the Fourth Amendment. You're not allowed to pull somebody over without cause. And we have a thing called the First Amendment, which means you're not allowed to be suspicious because someone has long hair or is wearing a hoodie,
right?
Because they're hanging out with certain people. We have freedom of association as well. And so my question is, because the name of this project is the Not Isolated Project, would you consider near universality to be isolated or pervasive?
Pervasive.
Right. And I knew you were going to say that because it's obvious. And this is the point. I'm trying to convince white people of two things. One, nonviolent police harassment, non-lethal police brutality, and straight up lynchings or murders. They're tied together. You can't separate them. And the second thing is when you look at them collectively, they're absolutely positively not isolated. Because I hear that all the time from white people, even some fairly well-intentioned white people will say, I don't understand. This looks like such an overreaction because these things are isolated. And I say, no, they're not.
Yeah.
Universal and isolated are pretty clearly not synonyms. And then what I also want to know is, Coach, if you want to share with us a little bit of your background and story, and also just add your thoughts, because you really do have a very unique perspective. You've worked in corporate America at a very high level. You've also worked in basketball in Third Ward, which is a historically black neighborhood and not a particularly affluent one. And you played D3 ball in rural Virginia. And now you're Division I head coach. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts to add and maybe share a little bit about your story, because it's a fascinating one.
Well, Pete, I think as it, trying to tailor it to your topic, I actually coached at Hampton Sydney, the D3 school you mentioned, and finished coaching and started to practice law in Houston, Texas. And I really felt called to work with, the young black youth through a program called Inner City Youth at the time. PJ Couisnard's father, Prince Couisnard, founded it. And, at the time, I don't know why. I mean, I'm a man of faith, and I believe God called me to that. And so ever since that time, it's been a passion for mine. Of mine. But Pete, my experience, my interaction with people of color to that point had really been very limited. I grew up in a predominantly white community. Went to a white private school. Went to a almost all white college. When I got to Houston, just felt called to work in this particular community, and fell in love with it and the people. My sense is Pete, is that, since you're focused on the white community, I can only really speak to my, obviously the white population is not monolithic, but I can only speak to my experience, which is, my relative inexperience with and lack of crossover and connection with the black community, really did not allow me to have any real perspective of their experience and of what they saw. And, as I began to, I subsequently got married, and we ended up adopting 3 African-American children. And, that was after I had been working with African-American youth for almost a decade. And again, my perspective changed dramatically when it transitioned from my players to my children. And so I guess my point is the lack of connectivity, the lack of deep relationship that I think we have with one another, that provides a void for empathy oftentimes. There's a chasm that can't be crossed, or that can't be met. We might intellectually understand the plight of somebody, but when you're really in relationship and living, day to day with people, and you hear their stories, you hear about their life experiences, that's what, probably transformed my perspective. And I've seen it transform the perspectives of my broader family, as we've adopted our children, and made the decision to live in Third Ward and be more involved in that particular community. And you asked for my general thoughts. I have two thoughts. One is, I think we still live in a very segregated world in large part. I think, if people say it's better than it used to be, maybe it is, compared to 30 years ago where there are mixed neighborhoods, probably not as much as there is today. But I still think how many relationships, authentic relationships, do people have of different race? I think those certainly exist, and I think a decent percentage of America experiences those. But I believe that you get changed, through that understanding and through that empathy. And the best way I know in my own personal experience has been when I've had relationships with people who are different than me, people who believe differently than I do, people who look differently, people who grew up differently. You can't broad brush, somebody or a whole category of people when you start to be able to put a face on that. And so I think that's a real issue. I think that's a real issue. And then the last thing, and then I'll let you get back, is, for me, I think so often, your focus is trying to reach, white people to help explain this issue. I think so often white people that I've spoken with about this, when they hear about this issue, their focus isn't systemic racism. It's not focused on institutional racism. It's much more, well, I'm not a white nationalist. I'm not flying a Confederate flag or shaving my head and having swastikas. So that's not me. That's not me. I'm not the problem. And, you mentioned bias. I think we all have bias. I think probably people who believe that they're not racist at all. They're still looking through the world through their lens, and everybody's lens, has a certain shade and a certain shape that it produces. And I think this time right now, with the Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd deaths, I think it's raising, to everyone's attention, that there is, an unbelievable bias, and that we do all need to examine, the bias that we look at the world through.
Well, I'll tell you, you brought up quite a few really interesting, relevant points. One is the personal relationships, the close, real personal relationships, right, as in groomsmen in a black wedding, that type of thing. And being basketball white people, we're uniquely fortunate to have a widespread group of legitimate, real relationships with black people. And I can tell you that before 12, 13, when I fell in love with basketball, I didn't. And I certainly would have been. I call myself a recovering racist because I don't think that I'm recovered. I think I'm still working through my own different racial biases. But when you're in the basketball world, it really frustrates me when white basketball people are indifferent or ignorant or blatantly bigoted. I'm like, how can you, but you personally know, because it's easy for a white person without a ton of relationships to say, oh, that story doesn't make any sense, because black people's experiences with police are so radically different than ours. But once you hear 45 stories from 45 different black friends, and they got a really similar theme, if you walk around with your eyes still shut, shame on you.
Right.
And then the second point is that it's the reason why I'm interviewing black friends and white friends. I believe that if white people only hear black voices talking about the abuse and the harassment they've suffered. I did a video with a good friend of mine from high school, straight A student, the whole 9 yards. Dad's a successful, living in a white neighborhood, and You know, he had a gun put to his head when he was 16 because they thought he was breaking into his own house. And that just doesn't happen to white people. But I know if the only voices white people hear are black voices, oh, that's not true. That doesn't really happen. They're just looking for attention. Hear that a lot about Colin Kaepernick. And so that's the reason why I want to include 50% white voices in this project, because it's just simply easier for white people to accept this information from another white person.
Right.
Again, because of racism. And then the last thing you brought up, which is fascinating, and I write about this a lot, the phenomenon is called comparative clemency. Okay, that's where I'm overweight, but I look at someone who's fatter and go, I'm not fat, that person's fat. And I just give myself a pass, even though I'm fat. And that's what racists do all the time. They say, well, exactly like you said, you just might not have had a term for it. It's the I'm not racist, Hitler's racist.
Right.
Bill Connor's racist, George Wallace is racist, David Duke is racist.
Right.
I'm not racist. I have lots of black friends. I don't see color, and so on and so forth. And so I'm really glad you recognize that. And I've had a lot of conversations trying to talk white people through that, of explaining that all life attributes have a scale. Right. I'm a Rockets fan, but Scott Gordon's a much bigger Rockets fan.
Right.
We're still both Rockets fans. It's just that I care at about a 3 on a 1 to 10 scale, and he cares at about a 9. Right. And racism, or again, any other attribute, there's also a scale, and we need to not issue to ourselves comparative clemency, because we know other people who share our negative characteristic in a more pronounced way.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think that's spot on. And some of the institutional and systemic racism that exists, you know, I think when you use the word racist, you know, hey, are you racist? You know, that's a painful term that carries with it a huge stigma. And so it's easy to dismiss, you know, in you know, full cloth, as opposed to.
Griff, can you hear me? Oh, here you go. Okay, you're back. You froze
Okay.
it. You froze it right when you said that to dismiss the allegation of being a racist full cloth.
Well, I think the issue is that so often, you know, when you hear the term racist, you know, that is, again, it's easily to dismiss oneself, or like you say, give yourself a pass, as opposed to actually saying, well, what does a racist look like? Well, a racist is really someone, I mean, it's a lot of things, but at its core, it's somebody who possesses a lot of bias. And, you know, again, it goes back to what you said. And I would argue that those who are even most promoting racial unity, we all have biases. We are all a product of our life experiences and our beliefs. Yeah, I do as well. And so I think being able to have people understand, yes, I do, and I'm not a bad person for necessarily having those, but I need to examine those, and I need to understand, why do I have those biases? Are they based and founded in truth, or are they based and founded in myth, or
brainwashing?
Propaganda? Yeah, brainwashing, propaganda, you know, a particular, you know, political narrative, or just fear of change, you know, fear of you know, a culture changing, or transformation of you know, belief in America, or whatever. And again, that's where I go. I think sometimes for me, when we think about making, you know, lasting change in America, you know, I do think it requires us to really examine and understand the latent bigotry that exists, and that I think is personally founded a lot in the bias that that many carry. And until that really gets understood and uncovered, then I think it's in some ways hard to take material steps forward.
Well, you again bring up some interesting points. I literally in the book I wrote talk about how the word racist is usually a conversation ender.
Yeah, that's right.
Because of comparative clemency. I'm not a racist. David Duke's a racist. That's a racist.
Right.
And I even make recommendations for some new terms like REBA, which is racially or ethnically biased American. I'm even trying to suggest new terms because you're right. Unfortunately, you call a racist, and right then and there in the moment, you totally murder his ears and his heart from possibly opening and having a chance to listen. And I talk as well, it's a generational thing. So if you think about it, when slavery ended, okay, the children of the enslavers, who wants to think of their own parents as being evil?
Right.
Nobody wants to think of that.
Right.
So the dehumanization that had existed previously, of course, continues. Right. Well, then, do you think the grandparents of the enslavers want to think of their grandkids as being evil?
Right.
No, of course not. And it's just gone from there. I make the analogy to climbing Justice Mountain. We were at the base or the foot, whatever the proper terminology is, of Justice Mountain after the Civil War, when we ended the evil institution of slavery. But if you think about it, 100 years later, we were maybe 10% up Justice Mountain.
Right.
Lynchings were still common.
Right.
Black people still couldn't get into colleges or get loans or buy a house. And what's frustrating to me is people act like we fought a civil war over this issue. 100 years later, it still wasn't fixed, but 2 packages of federal laws fixed the whole problem on a dime. That just defies any basic level of logic and reasoning. And so from 65 till today, 55 years, I think we're about 30% up the way of Justice Mountain, which means that we've gone twice as far in half the time, from 65 till today versus 1865 to 1965.
Right.
And so on one hand, it's nice to know we're doubling our progress in half the time. On the other hand, we're still 70% of the mountain to climb. Right. And so I think it's really, really important for white people to, if we're going to celebrate the progress, let's make damn sure it's a mobile celebration, not a stationary one.
And I really love this project, Pete, because I think you and I share, ethnicity and I think share a similar passion. And I think there is an unwillingness or, blind spot, whatever the reason is, for people to be aware of the issues that you're raising. And I think what it is they fail to understand the experience of the Black person. And I think it is a complicated, complex issue, all the reasons why people are unable to experience that, whether it's the comparative clemency you mentioned. I think another thing is people are there are a lot of white people who experience a lot of trauma in their lives. And it's hard. They're living hard lives, and they don't have the margin to think, well, I know you're having a hard life, but my life wasn't a cakewalk either. And we all just got to do the best that we can and move on. And, whatever the reason is, I'm not forgiving that perspective. I'm just, proposing possibilities of why people aren't as receptive and empathetic maybe. And again, I think the relationship piece is just a huge piece. But, again, that that to me is when we can truly understand. And, again, as a man of faith, I do believe we're all created in the image of God. And when we, and I'm a big believer that the church has really failed in this area. I don't know if you've analyzed that at all. But
very frustrating.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating. I mean, if there is an institution, I think I tweeted this, if there is an institution that should be leading in this regard, it should be the church. We say that we're in the Christian faith, that we're the family of God. Well, our brothers and sisters are hurting, and there is not that empathy. There is not that call to arms, so to speak. And the Bible says, to do justly and walk humbly before the Lord. Obviously a million other verses that speak to social justice issues. So I think all of those are really important. The last thing I would say too, Pete, is I really feel that there's a burden for the white community to reach out to our Black friends and our Black acquaintances. The reality is we are in the majority from a sheer population number and from a power structure, in the United States. And so to me, I feel that we have an obligation to try to understand and to show that empathy. And I think, I think that's something that gets lost too, is that I think there's a responsibility which, the Black community has obviously a very horrific history in this country of how they arrived here, and then their experience here for, the vast majority of their time here, as you say, up until today, which is hopefully progressively getting better. But I do think, I think we have as a population, a white population, a responsibility to try to empathize and to be the ones who reach out, rather than it, always having to be the Black community having to, protest and, scream about these issues. And it's sad that it takes, the recent events of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor to kind of get our attention.
Yeah, it is sad. And the question, of course, now becomes, and what I would like any white person who watches this, don't wonder, will things be different when the dust settles? Wonder, will I be different when the dust settles? Because truly, it's got to be micro before it can be macro. Each white person has to decide, this is not okay. This is not isolated. And we are going to demand change, not just through protest, but through the ballot box. Right. If 51% of white people decided that we're voting for candidates who support real, tangible reform in American policing, well, then the politicians would support it too. Right. People forget that the reason the civil rights movement happened was because Martin Luther King Jr. and others persuaded enough white people that the politicians had to act. The politicians are not going to act on their own. They're not collectively a bunch of righteous, selfless leaders. They're self-interested, and the self-interest is getting reelected. And if 51% of white people insist on racial justice, demand it, tell their politicians, we're going to vote you out if you don't stand with Black people here, then politicians are going to stand with Black people. Right. And it really is that simple. It's up to what Dr. King called the white moderates, which to me is about 80% of white people. I
Right.
think about 10% are real allies who are doing the best we know how. About 10% are KKK or KKK adjacent. And then about 80% are moderates, where probably not evil hearted, probably not willfully ill intentioned, just indifferent because it doesn't affect them directly because of
Right.
privilege. You touched on that earlier, and we'll try to finish it up. You and I could probably do a 7-hour podcast on this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you touched on it earlier that there are a lot of white people who've had hard lives who say, "Oh, I'm doing this and that," and the phrase white privilege was very angering, or you could say triggering, to a lot of white people. And to any white people out there listening who also felt angered, I was angry too when I first heard it.
Yeah.
Because I've had plenty of setbacks, traumatic events, failures, so on and so forth. Life has not been easy for me, and I thought, what a load of garbage. Like, it's not, all white people don't live on easy street. Well, then I read the article by Peggy McIntosh, the scholar, that was, I believe, the first time it was a publicly coined phrase, white privilege. And then I wasn't mad anymore because it had nothing to do with that. And that's what I want white folks to do, is self-educate. Because so much of your frustration is based on ignorance. I don't mean stupidity. I'm not calling you stupid, but ignorance, as in you literally don't know. White people need to read books to make them feel uncomfortable. They need to watch YouTube speeches and debates to make them feel uncomfortable. They need to have conversations that make them feel uncomfortable. Because privilege is a very broad topic. For example, I have big privilege. I was born large. That meant that I got bullied less as a kid. That meant that I was going to be better at sports. There are women out there who like bigger guys. I've had unearned romantic opportunities based on my X's and Y's, my DNA code, right? I have a lot of privileges. Male privilege doesn't mean that men are bad. It means that we don't walk through an unlit parking lot late at night scared, like a lot of women do. And that's what privilege means. So don't take it as, anyone listening, don't take it as an insult or a slight. And really, it's not a great brand. It ought to be female burden, not male privilege. It ought to be black burden, not male, not white privilege.
Well, and Pete, I think you're raising a good point, because again, even the term, white privilege, I don't know who coined it, but to me, politically, it's become a charged term to divide, not unify. I think to me, the first time I heard it, I said, well, hang on a second. I grew up, my parents were divorced. Like, I got 3 bipolar people in my family. Like life wasn't easy. Like, hang on a second, but my point, but I think the ultimate point is people are trying to explain, hey, just understand the context. But I think so often, you look at the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. I think that became, politically charged too. And people start saying, well, all lives matter. And you still there? People, started saying, well, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter. All the Black Lives Matter people are saying, hey, Black Lives Matter too. We agree all lives matter. We want to make sure that you think all lives matter and that Black Lives Matter, too. And,
by the way, Griff, have you ever heard the two, this will help bring it into focus, but my 2 favorite stories to explain this on Black Lives Matter is little Billy's sitting around the table at dinner. Everybody else has a full plate of food except for him. And he says, I need a plate of food. And they say, everyone needs a plate of food.
Right.
And they go right on eating while he still doesn't have a plate. Or there's a house on fire in a neighborhood and someone says, we gotta put the fire out to save this house. And everybody says, well, all houses matter.
Right.
Well, but the other houses aren't on fire.
Right.
And so the, branding, like I said, white privilege is not meant to denigrate white people.
Right.
It's meant
and Pete, that would be my hope, is that I think understanding, empathy, to me, that is going to be a real tool to help affect change.
I don't know if you heard George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, but she said, my father changed the world.
Yeah.
And at a minimum, we owe it to her to prove her right.
Yeah.
Because at this moment in time, I have not seen any real changes yet. But we might, if people keep the pressure up, especially middle 80% of white moderates. And so to close it up and kind of bring it full circle, talk about privilege, but also nonviolent police harassment. And this is like the rapid fire section, like the quick answers, okay? Have you ever been pulled over when you were not speeding or had your tags out?
No.
Have you ever been asked for your ID when you were walking down the street with 2 friends on your way to the park?
No.
No. And I haven't either. Now, on the first one I have, but all 3 times was in a black neighborhood. So even me as a white guy getting pulled over and harassed without reason was still related to racism against black people, because they couldn't think of any other reason for me to be in a black neighborhood other than nefariousness or being bad with directions.
Right.
It couldn't occur to them that I might have a black friend, a black girlfriend, or like to hoop at a mostly black park. Or in the case of Houston's 3rd Ward, maybe I'm friends with the staff at U of H and I'm driving over there to see them. Maybe I volunteer at the community center by Yates High School, which I used to supply with computers. There's 100 million reasons why I might be in a black neighborhood. And it really sucks that so many police are too racist to understand that. And so that, guys, that's white privilege. White privilege is that we don't, and they're extenuating circumstances. Let me be clear. I know white people who've been pulled over for no reason, okay? But they have Grateful Dead stickers on the bumper sticker, right? Or they got long hair, or they drive a Volkswagen van. And I want to be super clear. That's not okay either. It's not okay for the cops to violate the Constitution and pull people over who've not committed a moving violation and harass them just based on bias and prejudice, regardless of the color. It's just important to note, and I'm certainly not blaming the white people with long hair. That's changeable, though. And I'm not saying they should change it. I can't be clear enough. You can change your hair a lot easier than you can change being black. And so the white people who are more clean cut or drive a nice car, in the neighborhood where I grew up, Avalon in Houston, the cops never, ever, 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 ever stopped us and asked us for ID, sat us on the curb, put us in handcuffs, ran the driver's license till they figured out what was going on. And we were up to no good constantly. And that just never happened. And again, that's white privilege. So, Coach, I don't know if you got any final words to add, but you've touched on a lot of things, and really I wish we had more time, because a lot of the things that you touched on I'd like to unpack more. But
yeah, well, first I appreciate your efforts in this regard. Again, with 3 African American children, this is an issue that's certainly near and dear to my heart. And of course, with my players and former players and the community that I fell in love with in Houston.
By the way, sorry to interrupt. Did you know George Floyd's from 3rd Ward?
I did. In fact, PJ Kuznard, of course, is a close friend and coached he and his brother years ago, but they were close with George Floyd. And so, DZ Cofield, who was involved at the pastor at Good Hope, his daughter dated George Floyd, and know DZ from my involvement with him at the Forge in 3rd Ward. And so, I knew he was intimately involved and frankly, a well-respected member of that community, one of the CUNY Homes boys. So,
well, I'll tell you, we were teammates in '92 at Fonda.
Really?
And
I think I saw you tweet about that. Yeah.
My lasting memory of Floyd, when this first broke, I didn't know I knew his name was George Floyd, but no one called him George.
Right.
Everyone called him Floyd. And my lasting memory of him and his personal legacy as far as the person he was in Houston. And there's so few people you can say this about, but Coach, I never heard him say anything bad about anybody else, and I never heard anybody else say anything bad about him.
Wow.
And it's a short list of human beings you can say that about. So I'm not trying to claim a particular closeness with him. We were teammates for one summer, and summer league back then was so different. No practices, no travel ball, right? So I literally was, seeing him once a week for 45 minutes.
Right.
But I did know him well enough to like him.
Yeah.
And to recognize that he was basically universally well-liked. And everybody says that after somebody dies, even if the person was not well-liked. But in his case, it's actually true. So the world lost a good guy. And again, I really hope that we prove his daughter right. I really hope that this does lead to major positive changes in the U.S. and globally. And it's been interesting and hopeful to see that these protests are taking place globally, not just here. Righteousness is the sun. Indifference is the clouds blocking the sun.
Amen.
And it's time for white people to quit being indifferent, remove the clouds so that righteousness can shine through. Coach, I really appreciate your time so much, and it warms my heart knowing there are white basketball coaches like yourself who are not just about one tweet or about this moment, but about tangible action moving forward. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take unity amongst white people to come together and aggressively demand real structural change so that our systems, not just policing, but hopefully one day banking and housing and others, so that our systems become fair and equitable, and we can finally be the nation we were destined to be and live out our ideal and our creed. So, Coach, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Pete.